My sister married a European prince and explicitly banned me from her wedding. She looked me right in the eye and told me my natural locks and my dark skin would be an embarrassment to his royal aristocratic family. She said I was socially unfit to mingle with high society. So I stayed home in my Manhattan penthouse. But 7 hours into her lavish royal ceremony across the world, 3 black armored vehicles surrounded my building. Royal guards pounded on my door with a wax-sealed letter. The king had halted the wedding and demanded my presence immediately. My sister presented a priceless cultural heirloom to secure her place in the royal family, but they needed the world's top historical antiquities appraiser to verify it. They had no idea the expert they summoned was the very sister the bride had thrown away. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to join a community of people who know exactly how it feels to be the black sheep of the family. The scent of candied yams and roasted chicken filled the dining room, but the atmosphere was suffocating. I was reaching across the mahogany table for the crystal pitcher of water when Chloe snatched the heavy gold foil wedding invitation right out of my hands. The sharp paper sliced a tiny paper cut into my thumb. I looked up as my younger sister shoved the envelope into her designer handbag. "You are not coming," Chloe said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I cannot have you there." I wiped the tiny bead of blood from my thumb and stared at her. We were at our parents' house for Sunday dinner. This was supposed to be a celebration of her engagement to Prince Julian. Instead, it was an ambush. "Are you joking right now?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You are uninviting your own sister from your wedding." Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms. "You are socially unfit for a royal wedding, Maya. Look at you. You cannot come to Julian's castle smelling like chemical solvents and old dust, and those locks down your back. I asked you a dozen times to just press your hair for one weekend. His family is European royalty. They are traditional and refined. If you show up looking like a militant activist, his family will think we are ghetto. I cannot risk you embarrassing me in front of the king." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. "We are black women, Chloe," I said, staring at her chemically straightened hair and the skin-bleaching cream she secretly used. "I am a professional historical restorer. I preserve our history. There is nothing embarrassing about who we are." Evelyn. Our mother set her crystal glass of sweet tea on the table with a sharp clink. The sound echoed in the silent room. She did not look at me. She looked at Chloe with absolute adoration before turning her cold gaze my way. "Listen to your sister Maya." My mother said, her tone devoid of any maternal warmth. "I begged you to relax your hair and get a respectable corporate job. But you always had to be rebellious. You always had to make things difficult. Chloe is marrying royalty. She is elevating this family to a status we could have only dreamed of. We are finally gaining access to real society. You will just stay in your basement with your dusty antiques. I will simply tell his family that you are away on a business trip. It is better for everyone." I looked from my mother to my sister. The history of our family dynamic played out in this single moment. Chloe was light-skinned, agreeable to their superficial social climbing, and willing to erase every ounce of her heritage to fit into a white, aristocratic mold. I was the dark-skinned daughter with natural hair who chose a career in historical preservation over corporate banking. They had always treated me like a stain on their perfect image. "Julian expects a certain caliber of family," Chloe added, inspecting her massive diamond engagement ring. "We are going to be royalty, Maya. We cannot have the press photographing a woman who looks like you standing next to the royal family. It ruins the aesthetic." The silence that followed was heavy. A normal sister would have cried. A normal daughter would have begged her mother for defense. But I had spent 33 years swallowing their insults. I was done digesting their poison. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply stood up from the table and smoothed the fabric of my custom silk trousers. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up the bottle of vintage wine I had brought to celebrate her engagement. It was a $500 bottle. I had brought it as a gesture of peace. Now it was coming home with me. "Where are you going?" my mother demanded, finally showing a hint of emotion. We have not even served the peach cobbler yet. I am removing my embarrassing presents from your elegant evening, I said. I tucked the wine bottle under my arm and looked directly into Chloe's eyes. You have spent your whole life pretending to be something you are not, just to get a seat at a table that does not want you. Have a beautiful wedding, Chloe. Just remember, heavy crowns break weak necks. I walked out the front door, leaving my family sitting in the silent dining room. I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away without looking back. I did not need their validation. I knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. I just had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up. As it turned out, I would not wait long. 2 weeks later, the heavy scent of chemical solvents and aged wood filled my Manhattan penthouse. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sprawling laboratory I had built, overlooking the city skyline. I wore a protective apron over my silk loungewear, carefully applying a specialized enzyme mixture to a 17th-century canvas. It was a portrait of a dark-skinned African noblewoman whose history had been intentionally painted over by European colonizers centuries ago. I was bringing her original face back to the surface. It was meticulous work that required absolute precision. My phone buzzed violently on the stainless steel counter, shattering the quiet focus of my sanctuary. The screen lit up with a continuous stream of notifications from the family group chat. I peeled off my latex gloves and picked up the device. Dozens of photos flooded the screen. There was my sister Chloe, draped in an obscenely expensive white designer gown, standing in the grand courtyard of a European castle. She was surrounded entirely by white aristocrats, beaming as she clung to Prince Julian. Her hair was pressed bone straight, a physical manifestation of her desperate need to assimilate into their world. Another message popped up, this one, a direct text from my mother, Evelyn. It read, "The king is so proper and traditional. Thank God you stayed home, Maya. Your locks and your loud opinions would have completely ruined the aesthetic of this royal gathering. We finally belong where we were meant to be." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar sting of their lifelong rejection. My mother had always viewed my dark skin and natural hair as a social liability. She spent my entire childhood trying to scrub away our heritage, chemically burning my scalp with relaxers, while saving every penny to send Chloe to cotillion classes with the white elite. She viewed my career as a dirty secret, telling her country club friends I was just a glorified janitor for old furniture. She had absolutely no idea that Antiquity Holdings, the firm I built from the ground up, commanded global respect and held assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I locked the phone screen, tossing it back onto the counter. I refused to let their toxic desperation ruin my morning. I picked up my restoration tools, ready to return to the noblewoman on the canvas. The sudden screech of heavy tires on the pavement below echoed up to my balcony. It was sharp enough to make me pause. I walked over to the reinforced glass windows and looked down at the busy Manhattan street. 3 massive armored black SUVs had violently swerved into the loading zone of my building, blocking traffic entirely. Doors flew open. A dozen men stepped out wearing tailored black suits and discreet tactical gear. They moved with military precision, bypassing the doorman desk entirely. My intercom buzzed frantically. I pressed the receiver button, hearing the panicked voice of Marcus, my building concierge. "Miss Maya, I am so sorry, they just pushed right past me. They claim they have diplomatic immunity and are heading straight for your private elevator." The line abruptly went dead. A harsh mechanical chime echoed through the penthouse as my private elevator doors forced themselves open. I did not panic. I calmly walked to the center of my living room, crossing my arms over my chest. 4 men marched into my home. They were massive, their posture rigid and unyielding. They did not look like local law enforcement or private security. They wore silver lapel pins bearing the distinct crest of the European royal family Chloe was currently marrying into. The man at the front stepped forward. He had a stern, weathered face and ice-cold blue eyes. He did not bother with pleasantries or introductions. He simply demanded my attention. "You are Maya, the historical antiquities appraiser." I did not flinch. "I am Maya, the owner of this penthouse, which you just broke into without a warrant. I suggest you turn around and get back into your elevator before I have you arrested for trespassing." The captain did not move. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy parchment envelope. It was bound with a thick crimson ribbon and sealed with the official crest of King Henrik stamped in dark red wax. He held it out toward me, his expression deadpan. "We do not have time for jurisdictional arguments, Miss Maya. The royal wedding has been completely halted. His Majesty King Henrik demands your presence in Europe immediately." I stared at the wax seal, my mind racing rapidly. Halted. A royal wedding with hundreds of international dignitaries does not just pause. I took the envelope from his hand and broke the seal. The heavy paper inside bore a handwritten message. It was brief and frantic. It stated that a priceless cultural heirloom presented as a dowry had been flagged by the royal historians. The king had dismissed his entire appraisal staff, declaring there was only one woman in the world with the specific expertise to verify the artifact. I looked up at the captain, a sharp realization hitting me. The heirloom. Chloe had actually done it. My sister had taken the fake replica of our great-grandmother's emerald headpiece, trying to pass it off as an authentic aristocratic artifact to secure her royal marriage. She was trying to scam a king. The captain checked his watch. "We have a private royal jet waiting at Teterboro Airport. The airspace has been cleared for an emergency departure. We must leave now." I walked back to my laboratory counter. I looked at the group chat photo of Chloe smiling so smugly in her white gown. Then I looked at the dark-skinned noblewoman I was restoring on the canvas. It was time to bring the truth to the surface. I grabbed my specialized metal appraisal briefcase, snapping the heavy steel locks shut. I turned back to the royal guards, a cold smile forming on my face. "Lead the way, Captain. Let us go save a kingdom." The interior of the massive royal jet was an absolute masterclass in understated European wealth. Sleek cream leather seats, polished burled walnut tables, and brushed gold accents lined the pressurized cabin. I sank into the plush leather chair positioned directly opposite the captain, placing my heavy steel appraisal briefcase precisely on the polished table between us. While I remained perfectly still, the captain paced the narrow carpeted aisle. He pressed a black satellite phone tightly to his ear, firing off rapid, frantic commands in sharp German. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, a stark contrast to his crisp, black military uniform. I caught urgent fragments of his intense conversation. Words like scandal, security breach, containment, and disaster echoed loudly in the quiet cabin space. I crossed my legs, smoothing the sharp crease of my custom silk trousers, and waited in silence. I had built a massive global business empire by mastering the difficult art of patience. Let him sweat out his panic. Finally, he slammed the heavy satellite phone onto its receiver, exhaling a very sharp, exhausted breath. He dropped heavily into the wide seat across from me, aggressively rubbing his temples with both hands. I leaned forward, resting my elbows firmly on the walnut table. "You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me why you dragged me out of my Manhattan laboratory," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet, but completely authoritative. "Or I will instruct the pilot to turn this private jet around and land back at Teterboro Airport immediately. You cannot simply kidnap an American citizen, regardless of how many fancy wax seals your king puts on a demanding envelope." The captain swallowed hard, his strict military composure slipping noticeably under my gaze. "Miss Maya, I assure you, this is absolutely not a kidnapping. It is a highly critical matter of national security for the crown. The royal wedding has suddenly become an unprecedented international incident." I raised a skeptical eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue his explanation. "Your younger sister, Chloe," he began, his voice tight with lingering stress, "presented a formal dowry to the king this morning, before the ceremony started. She claimed it was a priceless African heirloom, a royal artifact passed down securely through your aristocratic bloodline. She presented this item to prove her family holds a social status entirely equal to His Royal Highness, Prince Julian." I stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then a sharp, bitter laugh erupted directly from my chest. It echoed loudly and freely in the quiet jet cabin. I could not stop laughing at the absolute absurdity. My sister's endless desperation had reached a critical, spectacular peak. Chloe had actually done it. She had boldly tried to con a reigning European monarch. What exactly did this supposedly priceless heirloom look like, I asked, wiping a single tear of pure amusement from my right eye. The captain looked highly uncomfortable, shifting his weight in the leather seat. A heavy, solid gold headpiece, intricately woven, featuring 7 massive emeralds, cut in a very specific pre-colonial style. Your sister swore it belonged to an ancient African warrior queen and has been treasured in your family for countless generations. My laughter died instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthless focus. I knew exactly what piece she had presented to the king. It was a complete replica. A cheap, flashy theater prop commissioned back in 2014 by my status-obsessed mother Evelyn. She had it specially made for a ridiculous suburban country club gala, because she desperately wanted to pretend our family had generational wealth and royal ties. The real headpiece, the actual authentic heirloom, had been entrusted solely to me by my great-grandmother right before she passed away. She knew exactly what would happen. She knew my mother and Chloe would instantly sell our true cultural heritage for a quick cash grab or a fleeting moment of white validation. I reached out quickly and flicked the twin steel latches on my heavy briefcase. They popped open with a loud, satisfying metallic crack that made the captain jump slightly. I lifted the lid, exposing the dense black foam interior housing my entire professional life. High-powered ultraviolet flashlights, precision jeweler loops, reactive chemical testing swabs, and advanced digital micrometers sat perfectly arranged in their custom-designated slots. The captain leaned forward eagerly, his eyes widening as he took in the gleaming precision appraisal instruments. "My sister is a desperate, pathetic fraud," I said, my voice dripping with absolute certainty. "She stole a cheap glass and synthetic resin replica directly from our mother's bedroom vanity, genuinely thinking she could pass it off to a royal court as a priceless historical antiquity. She honestly thought she could easily buy her way into your elite royal family with factory-made fake emeralds and a completely fabricated lineage." The royal historians flagged the questionable piece immediately, the captain admitted, staring intently at my specialized tools. They noticed severe inconsistencies in the metalwork casting and the modern gemstone faceting techniques. They strongly advised King Henrik to halt the ceremony abruptly before the sacred vows were legally exchanged. The global press is currently being told there is only a minor scheduling delay, but the entire castle is currently on total lockdown. I pulled a pair of white appraisal gloves from a hidden compartment of the briefcase and laid them flat on the walnut table. "If your historians already know it is fake, why am I here? Why send armored vehicles and a private jet to drag me across the Atlantic Ocean? The king could just throw her in a dungeon right now and be done with it." The captain finally met my unwavering gaze, his expression shifting from frantic panic to deep professional respect. He looked down at the white cotton gloves, then into my eyes. "The king fired his top appraiser today. He said there is only one woman in the world who holds the truth about this artifact: you." The flight across the Atlantic felt like a blink. A private helicopter transferred me directly from the tarmac to the sprawling, manicured grounds of the royal estate. The sheer scale of the stone castle was staggering, but I was entirely unfazed. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall stood wide open, guarded by dozens of anxious-looking men in uniform. I marched right past them, my steel briefcase swinging at my side. I stepped into the cathedral-sized room and hit a wall of absolute dead silence. It was breathtakingly awkward. Hundreds of Europe's most elite aristocrats sat rigidly in their carved mahogany pews. Nobody was smiling or even moving. Nobody was speaking above a hushed, frantic whisper. The air felt thick with scandal. The towering stained glass windows bathed the room in a kaleidoscope of colors, but the massive altar at the front of the hall was completely empty. The royal priest stood off to the side, looking incredibly uncomfortable. I kept my head held high, my boots echoing against the marble floors. I did not look like one of them, and I did not care. I walked down the center aisle with the absolute authority of a woman who held their entire royal legacy inside a metal box. Before I could reach the front row, a figure broke away from the crowd of bridesmaids. It was my father, Marcus. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of panic and rage. His rented tuxedo looked stiff and uncomfortable across his shoulders. He lunged into the center aisle and grabbed my arm with a violent, forceful grip. His fingers dug deeply into my bicep, pulling me to an abrupt halt. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a desperate, venomous whisper. "Did you sneak in to ruin your sister's day?" I stared down at his hand and then back up to his panicked eyes. He was sweating profusely. He was terrified that my presence would somehow contaminate his one chance at brushing shoulders with high society. I could see my mother Evelyn sitting in the front pew clutching a lace handkerchief, looking at me like I was a disease that had just infected her perfect fantasy. She mouthed the words, "Get out at me." I did not move. I did not shrink down the way they had conditioned me to do my entire childhood. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. "Let go of my arm, Marcus," I commanded, stripping him of the title of father. He gripped tighter, trying to pull me toward a side exit. "You are going to leave right now, Maya, before the royal family sees you. You are not going to humiliate us." I twisted my arm sharply, snapping his wrist back just enough to break his hold. He stumbled backward, rubbing his hand in shock. I smoothed my sleeve, keeping my posture impeccably straight. "Ruin it?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the silent, echoing hall. "Like how you ruined my credit at 18 by illegally using my social security number to pay for Chloe's European backpacking trip." Gasps erupted from the nearby pews. Several aristocrats leaned in eagerly, feeding on the drama. My father's face drained of all color. "Keep your voice down," he pleaded, looking around frantically. I stepped closer to him, forcing him to back away. "You stole my identity to fund her luxury vacation because she needed to look the part for her wealthy friends," I continued relentlessly. "You saddled me with $50,000 in debt before I even stepped foot in a college classroom. You told me it was my duty to sacrifice for the family image. I spent a decade clawing my way out of the financial grave you dug for me while you paraded her around as your golden child. I am not here to ruin anything. I am here because the very people you are so desperate to impress realized your golden child is selling them a lie." "Maya, shut your mouth right now." Chloe burst from a side chamber, storming into the center aisle. She looked like an exploding meringue in her massive white designer gown. The heavy silk and excessive tulle swished aggressively around her feet. Her face was flushed with fury, and her elaborate makeup was beginning to shine with nervous sweat. "You are a jealous, bitter liar," she screamed, abandoning any pretense of royal refinement. "You just could not stand that I got the prince and you got nothing. You came here to destroy my wedding because no man will ever look at you the way Julian looks at me." I looked her up and down, taking in the sheer desperation radiating from her every movement. I looked at the extravagant diamond necklace hanging around her neck and the priceless lace veil trailing behind her on the polished floor. It was a pathetic display of a woman trying to buy a personality. "I got an empire, Chloe! You got a costume!" she shrieked loudly, lunging forward like a wild animal. She raised her hand high into the air, fully intending to slap me across the face right in front of the entire European aristocracy. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to block her. I just stared at her, waiting for the strike. Before her manicured hand could even begin its descent, a booming voice echoed from the grand staircase above us. It was a voice that commanded nations. "Touch my VIP guest, and you will spend your honeymoon in a dungeon." Every single person in the hall froze instantly. Chloe dropped her hand, gasping in pure terror. We all looked up in absolute silence. King Henrik stood at the top of the marble stairs, glaring down at my family with absolute unfiltered disgust. He slowly began his descent down the massive stairs, his heavy velvet cape trailing ominously behind him as his royal guards immediately moved to secure the entire perimeter. The heavy silence in the grand hall broke only when King Henrik reached the polished marble floor. His piercing gaze swept over my family, lingering on Chloe with an expression of absolute disdain. He gestured sharply to his royal guards. "Escort them to my private study," he commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Not another word until we are behind closed doors." The guards immediately flanked my mother, my father Chloe, and Prince Julian. They did not touch me. Instead, the captain of the guard offered me a respectful nod, pointing me toward a set of towering mahogany doors at the far end of the corridor. I walked behind my family, watching them stumble in their expensive rented clothes. Chloe practically dragged her massive train across the floor, sobbing dramatically into her hands. Prince Julian walked a few paces away from her, rubbing his temples and looking completely furious. My parents exchanged panicked whispers, clearly trying to coordinate a fabricated story to save their golden child. The king's private study was a masterclass in historical wealth. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound centuries-old texts. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room. King Henrik did not sit. He waited until the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing us inside. Then he reached into a velvet-lined lockbox on his desk and pulled out a glittering object. With a swift, aggressive motion, he slammed the emerald headpiece onto the solid oak table. The heavy metal clattered loudly, making my mother jump backward. "Explain this," Henrik demanded, looking directly at Chloe. Chloe immediately collapsed into a nearby leather chair, burying her face in her hands. She unleashed a torrent of hysterical tears, playing the victim with practiced perfection. "Julian," she wailed, reaching out toward the prince, who notably took a half-step back. "My sister is a jealous, malicious liar. She came here to steal my heirloom. She has always hated me because I am beautiful and successful, and she is just a bitter, lonely woman hiding in a basement. She snuck into the castle to ruin my wedding day and steal our family legacy." Evelyn rushed to Chloe's side, wrapping a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. She glared at me with pure hatred. "Your Majesty," my mother said, forcing her voice into a sickly sweet tone of mock apology. "I am so sorry for this disruption. Maya has always been deeply disturbed. She is intensely jealous of her sister. When Chloe turned 16, Maya deliberately destroyed her birthday cake out of pure spite. We have tried to get her psychiatric help for years, but she refuses. She just wants to sabotage Chloe's happiness because she knows she will never achieve this level of grace and social standing. Please have your guards remove her so the ceremony can continue." Marcus stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to look like a protective patriarch. He pointed a thick finger at me. "I demand you leave this room, Maya. You have humiliated us for the last time. Hand over whatever fake documents you forged to get in here, and get out before I press charges for harassment." I did not even look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked on the king. The absurd lies flowing from my mother's mouth were completely standard. She was referencing a party where she forced me to carry a massive cake upstairs alone, causing me to fall. She blamed me for the accident and made me pay for the replacement with my babysitting money. That was the reality of the Wilson household. Any failure was my fault, and any success belonged to Chloe. King Henrik completely ignored Marcus and Evelyn. He did not even acknowledge Chloe's dramatic sobbing. He walked slowly around the oak desk, stopping directly in front of me. The intense anger in his eyes faded slightly, replaced by a look of deep professional respect. He offered a slight bow of his head. "Miss Maya, your global reputation truly precedes you. When my lead historian mentioned that Antiquity Holdings had the foremost expert on pre-colonial African artifacts, I assumed we would be flying in a senior academic. I had no idea the CEO herself possessed such profound specialized knowledge, nor did I realize you shared blood with the bride." My parents froze. Evelyn's mouth hung slightly open. Marcus lowered his pointing finger, his face draining of color. "They spent my entire adult life intentionally ignoring my career and telling friends I was a struggling artist." Hearing a European monarch refer to me as a CEO completely short-circuited their reality. "I am honored to be of service, Your Majesty," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional and completely devoid of any familial emotion. My firm handles the authentication of cultural heritage artifacts for museums across the globe. I understand there is a question regarding the validity of the dowry presented to your royal court today. King Henrik gestured to the glittering emerald headpiece resting on the oak table. He looked at it with a mixture of disgust and suspicion. Is this the artifact your family claims validates their highborn status? Your sister presented this piece stating it is a verified ancient royal heirloom passed down through a sacred lineage. My historians believe it is a modern fabrication, but Prince Julian insisted we proceed with the wedding based on her word. I need absolute undeniable proof. Julian spoke, his face flushed red with deep anger. Chloe swore her family descended from royalty, he said. If this is a fake, she mocked my name. Chloe sobbed loudly, gripping her mother's arm. It is real, Julian, I swear. My sister is trying to steal it. I calmly walked toward the oak desk. I unlatched my appraisal briefcase and opened the lid. I put on white appraisal gloves, pulling a UV flashlight from my kit. Let us see what my sister's status is really made of. I flicked the heavy switch on the base of my specialized ultraviolet flashlight. A sharp beam of intense purple light cut immediately through the dim shadows of the king's private study. I directed the high-powered beam straight down onto the heavy gold and green headpiece resting on the oak desk. The reaction was instantaneous and violently undeniable. I did not even need to lean in to inspect it closely. Under a proper ultraviolet spectrum, genuine ancient emeralds from the African continent would remain a deep, inert, natural hue. Some might show a faint dusty red fluorescence depending on their exact chromium content. These particular stones did no such thing. Instead, the 7 massive gems instantly erupted into a blinding, toxic neon green glow. The bright artificial light reflected off the polished mahogany walls, illuminating the room with the harsh color of cheap commercial plastics. They looked exactly like glowing radioactive waste. It was the absolute unmistakable signature of synthetic resin and cheap factory glass injected heavily with modern fluorescent dyes. I did not even bother pulling out my precision jeweler's loop. I simply reached out with my white cotton appraisal gloves and picked up the surprisingly light headpiece. I turned it over, exposing the underside of the jewel settings to the king. The metalwork was perfectly uniform, completely devoid of the distinct irregular hammer marks characteristic of 16th-century craftsmanship. The prongs holding the glowing fake stones were perfectly machine-stamped. I dropped the heavy piece back down onto the oak desk with a dull clatter. The sound lacked the rich resonance of solid gold. Glass, I announced, letting my voice ring with absolute chilling authority. Cheap synthetic resin. The gold casing is nothing but a thin brass plating over a base alloy core. This piece was manufactured in a commercial factory, probably in 2014. This is not a priceless ancient heirloom. This is a cheap, tacky prop from a suburban community theater department. King Henrik leaned forward, placing both of his large hands flat on the oak desk. He stared intently at the glowing green resin, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscles feathering under his weathered skin. The absolute audacity of the insult was finally registering in his mind. He had halted a globally televised royal wedding because of a piece of brass and plastic. The situation was an absolute unprecedented public nightmare for the entire monarchy and its historical legacy. Evelyn launched herself forward, breaking away from Marcus. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of sheer desperation and unhinged rage. Her perfectly styled hair bounced wildly as she pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You malicious hater!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully in the confined space. "You are lying. You are making this up just to destroy your sister. You have always been jealous of her beauty. We have the official certificate of authenticity directly from your grandmother. She gave it to me right before she died. She swore it was real." I stepped right into my mother's personal space, forcing her to look me directly in the eye. I did not raise my voice at all, letting the cold, hard truth act as my absolute weapon. "She gave you a piece of paper, Evelyn?" I snapped back my words, slicing through the heavy air of the study like a scalpel. a completely worthless piece of paper she had me forge on my laptop computer when I was 16. We printed it on heavy parchment and stamped it with a fake wax seal we bought at a craft store. Grandma left the real authentic headpiece to me. She locked the genuine antiquity in a high-security vault in Geneva and handed me the only existing key. She did that because she knew exactly who you were. She knew you two would immediately sell our sacred cultural heritage to buy a fleeting moment of white validation. She knew you would trade our entire ancestral bloodline for an invitation to a restrictive country club or a chance to rub elbows with the European elite. I watched the truth hit her like a physical blow. Evelyn stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the thick Persian rug. She bumped into Marcus, who caught her arm, but his eyes were darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape route that did not exist. The royal guards standing at attention by the heavy doors shifted their stance, their hands resting instinctively on their holstered weapons. The absolute humiliation of my family was finally laid bare for the reigning monarch to witness. Chloe was hyperventilating now, clutching the heavy silk of her wedding dress, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. She looked down at the neon green fake on the desk and let out a pathetic whimpering sound. She had staked her entire fabricated identity on a piece of plastic I had helped mock up as a teenager. Prince Julian, who had been standing rigidly by the towering bookshelves throughout the exchange, suddenly moved. He did not look like a charming fairy tale prince anymore. His handsome face was flushed a deep, furious red. The veins in his neck stood out sharply against his crisp, stiff white collar. He stepped forward, his shoes echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. He ignored my parents entirely and marched straight toward Chloe. He backed her directly into the corner of the room. Chloe shrank back against the leather-bound books, her massive white gown bunching up awkwardly around her legs. She raised her hands defensively, but Julian slammed his hand against the bookshelf right next to her head, trapping her completely. "You lied to me," he demanded, his voice, a terrifying growl that shattered her carefully constructed facade. "You sat in my family estate and told me your family held a massive ancestral fortune. You swore you had generational estates and priceless artifacts. You are completely broke." Julian's fingers dug ruthlessly into the delicate lace covering Chloe's upper arm. He yanked her forward roughly, completely, ignoring the tearing sound of expensive bridal fabric. Chloe let out a sharp cry of actual physical pain, stumbling awkwardly in her heavy designer heels. Julian did not care. His grip tightened visibly until his knuckles turned a stark bone white against her dark skin. He shook her once hard enough to make her elaborate diamond tiara slip sideways, tangling in her meticulously styled hair. "Where is the real one?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave into something primal and ugly. "Tell me where the authentic headpiece is right now." Chloe sobbed uncontrollably, mascara running in dark, ugly rivers down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining hours of professional makeup application. "I do not have it," she wailed, her voice pitching into a hysterical screech that grated against the quiet elegance of the king's study. "I swear to you, Julian, I do not have it. My mother told me this one was real. She said it was exactly the same as the one my great-grandmother locked away. We just needed you to marry me first to make it official. We were going to figure the rest of the financial details out later, once I was a princess." Evelyn lunged forward from her spot near the doorway, her maternal instincts finally overriding her deep ingrained fear of the royal guards. "Unhand my daughter, you brute!" she shrieked, reaching out with her manicured hands to claw at Julian's tailored suit jacket. A massive royal guard stepped smoothly into her path, catching her firmly by the shoulders and shoving her back against the heavy mahogany doors with effortless strength. Marcus pressed himself flat against the wood paneling, refusing to step forward to protect either his wife or his so-called golden child. His cowardice was absolute and pathetic to witness. And Julian shoved Chloe away with a disgusted scoff. She collapsed onto the ornate Persian rug, a weeping pile of ruined white silk and shattered social climbing illusions. The prince did not offer her a second glance. His charming aristocratic mask had completely dissolved, revealing the greedy, entitled predator lurking underneath his polished exterior. He turned his furious gaze directly on me. He marched across the room, closing the distance between us until he stood towering over the heavy oak desk, a physical threat meant to intimidate. He slammed both of his hands down onto the wood right next to my specialized appraisal equipment, making the fake emerald headpiece rattle. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale champagne and bitter panic on his breath. "You have the real one," he spat, his blue eyes wide and manic with desperation. "Hand it over. It belongs to the royal family now by right of marriage, I command you." I did not flinch. I did not lean back or show a single ounce of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. I held my ground, meeting his crazed stare with absolute chilling indifference. I slowly pulled the white cotton appraisal gloves off my hands, deliberately taking my time to emphasize my complete lack of respect for his supposed royal authority. I tossed them casually onto the table next to the glowing neon green replica. I snapped my briefcase shut and locked the steel latches with a loud, defining click that echoed sharply in the tense room. "You do not command me, little boy," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, but carrying a weight that forced everyone in the room to listen. "And you do not want the crown for tradition. You do not care about blending our families or celebrating cultural history. You want it because your family is entirely bankrupt." A sharp collective gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the private study. King Henrik stepped backward, as if he had been physically struck, his hand flying to the heavy gold medals pinned to his military chest. He looked between me and his son, his face pale with sudden horrific realization. Chloe stopped crying mid-sob. She looked up from the floor, wiping a smudge of black makeup from her chin. She stared at Julian, her brow furrowed in deep, uncomprehending confusion. "Bankrupt," she whispered the word, sounding entirely foreign to her status-obsessed brain. "But he is a prince. He lives in a literal castle." I laughed, a short, humorless sound that cut through the heavy tension in the room like a freshly sharpened blade. "A castle heavily mortgaged to private shell companies operating out of the Cayman Islands." I corrected her, never breaking eye contact with the furious prince standing before me. Julian opened his mouth to shout a denial, but no words came out. His jaw worked silently, his face cycling rapidly from angry red to an ashen, sickly gray as his deepest secret was dragged into the light. "When your heavily armed guards showed up at my Manhattan penthouse demanding I fly across the ocean to authenticate a priceless artifact, I did not just pack my bags blindly, I explained, my tone shifting into a sharp professional cadence. I run a global corporation. I do not step into any negotiation blind. The moment I boarded that private jet, I instructed my intelligence team to run a complete comprehensive financial audit on the royal estate. I wanted to know exactly why a reigning European monarch was so desperate to secure an African antiquity that he would halt a highly publicized royal wedding. I reached into the hidden side pocket of my tailored silk trousers and pulled out my sleek black iPad. The device felt heavy and powerful in my hands, a modern weapon against ancient entitlement. I held it up so the polished screen caught the light from the antique crystal chandeliers above us. King Henrik took a slow, hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the dark screen. Julian remained frozen, his hands still gripping the edge of the oak desk, his knuckles bone white. "Your royal advisors have been incredibly creative with your accounting." I continued, tapping the screen to wake it up. "But forensic accountants know exactly where to look. They follow the hidden debt. They follow the restructured loans, the secretly liquidated historical assets, and the quiet, desperate transfers of royal properties to private holding firms." I swiped my finger across the smooth glass, entering a complex 16-digit passcode to bypass the military-grade security encryption. The screen illuminated instantly, casting a cool blue glow across my face. I opened the heavily encrypted financial dossier my team had compiled during the transatlantic flight. Bold red numbers and stark downward trending graphs filled the high-resolution display, painting a picture of absolute financial ruin. "Let us look at the real numbers, Your Majesty," I said, turning the iPad around and sliding it firmly across the polished oak desk toward King Henrik. Let us see exactly how many millions your son lost in bad investments, and why he was so willing to marry a desperate American woman, holding a factory-made fake. King Henrik hesitated for a fraction of a second, his cold eyes dropping to the sleek device in my hand. I did not wait for him to lean over the heavy oak desk and squint at the small screen. I tapped a single icon on the top right corner of my tablet. A soft digital chime sounded from the far wall of the private study. A massive 80-inch smart television, previously disguised as a framed Renaissance landscape painting, flickered to life instantly. The high-definition display mirrored my encrypted financial dossier, casting a harsh artificial glow across the room. Stark, aggressive red numbers illuminated the dark oak paneling of the king's private sanctuary. It was a merciless digital guillotine suspended right above Prince Julian's perfectly coiffed head. I stepped away from the desk, allowing the sheer volume of his financial crimes to speak for themselves. Graphs plummeting into the negative millions flashed rapidly across the screen, detailing offshore bank accounts, frozen assets, defaulted luxury loans, and a staggering trail of unpaid private debts. Julian stared at the glowing screen as if a loaded weapon had just been pointed squarely between his eyes. His jaw hung slack. The arrogant royal prince was completely paralyzed by the undeniable mathematical proof of his absolute ruin. I slowly paced the length of the antique Persian rug, my heels clicking softly against the polished floorboards. I pointed sharply at the largest, ugliest red number blinking furiously in the center of the display. "You have $40 million in hidden debt," I announced, my voice ringing with brutal clinical clarity that sliced through the heavy silence. 40 million, Julian. You poured millions into speculative offshore crypto ventures and completely botched commercial real estate development schemes in Dubai. You hemorrhaged your private royal trust fund 3 years ago and immediately began illegally borrowing against sacred crown assets just to cover your catastrophic losses. You targeted my sister simply because she aggressively portrayed herself as a wildly wealthy American heiress. She rented yachts on credit, wore high-end designer knockoffs, and hired luxury cars just to catch your desperate eye. I turned slowly to look at Chloe. She was shaking violently, her hands gripping the shredded lace of her wedding gown. "And you, Chloe, you targeted him because you honestly thought he was your golden ticket to endless generational wealth. You genuinely thought marrying a European prince meant endless tiaras, private jets, and massive palace estates." I laughed, a harsh, biting sound that echoed off the leather-bound books lining the study walls. It is the perfect modern tragedy. You are both completely broke frauds marrying each other for money that absolutely does not exist. You scammed a scammer. The sheer irony would be hilarious if it were not so intensely pathetic. My father Marcus suddenly snapped out of his stunned paralysis. His face contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged denial. He refused to accept that his ultimate social climbing fantasy was crashing down around him in real time. He lunged across the private study, rushing violently toward the massive television screen. "Shut up, Maya," he bellowed, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He blindly grabbed at the thick black cables bundled behind the television, yanking at them violently in a pathetic attempt to plunge the room back into comfortable darkness. "Shut up right now. Julian is a prince. He has royal blood. You are just a spiteful, bitter liar trying to ruin the greatest day of our entire family history." He managed to rip a heavy power cord from the wall socket, but the television was hardwired directly into the castle's backup grid. The red numbers continued to glow brightly, reflecting off his sweating forehead. I did not raise my voice, but my words hit him with the force of a freight train. "He is a prince of debt, Marcus," I said, letting the absolute truth crush him. "And you are a fool. You remortgaged your house 3 separate times just to pay for this fake wedding. You completely drained your retirement accounts, took out predatory loans with astronomical interest rates, and maxed out every single credit card under Evelyn's name just to buy Chloe this one single day of pretend royalty. You are literally facing foreclosure next Tuesday morning, Did you plan on moving into the royal guest house when the bank seizes your property next week? Evelyn let out a piercing, gut-wrenching wail, finally realizing the inescapable reality of their complete financial annihilation. Her perfectly constructed absolute world of high society galas and elite country club luncheons had just completely evaporated. She collapsed heavily into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands, weeping bitterly for her permanently lost country club status. Chloe stared at Julian, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice trembling with profound shock. "You told me we were spending our honeymoon on your private island in the Maldives. You told me I would never have to worry about money ever again." Julian did not even look at her. He turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward his father. The prince was sweating heavily through his bespoke tuxedo, his chest heaving with trapped panic. "Father, do something," he pleaded, stepping toward the king with his hands raised in desperate supplication. "She hacked highly classified royal servers. This is treason. Arrest her. Throw her in the dungeon right now." King Henrik did not move to comfort his son. He did not call for the heavily armed royal guard waiting right outside the door. Instead, he looked at Julian with an expression of such profound, icy disgust that the prince visibly shrank backward. The vast room fell so incredibly silent, I could distinctly hear the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the dark corner. Miss Maya the king finally said, his voice sounding dangerously low and calm. "Tell me, is it actually true that you personally bought his entire debt?" I did not answer the king immediately. Instead, I walked slowly around the massive oak desk, trailing my fingertips lightly along the polished wooden edge. I bypassed the ornate velvet guest chairs designated for commoners and moved directly toward the high-backed leather armchair resting at the head of the grand table. This was the monarch's personal seat of power, the throne of his private sanctuary. I turned and sat down, settling deeply into the luxurious plush leather. I crossed my legs, smoothing the crisp crease of my tailored trousers with precision. The sheer audacity of my calculated movement sent a visible shockwave through the royal guards standing by the heavy doors. The captain instinctively gripped the hilt of his weapon, preparing to drag me from the chair for this unprecedented disrespect. King Henrik raised a single sharp hand, halting their aggressive advance instantly. He recognized a definitive power shift when he saw one. I steepled my fingers, resting them on the dark wood next to the glowing green fake tiara. "Yes, Your Majesty," I replied, keeping my tone completely conversational, as if we were casually discussing the afternoon weather over tea. My firm antiquity holdings bought the prince's massive consolidated debt portfolio directly from the Swiss bank last Tuesday morning. I shifted my gaze away from the king and pinned Julian to the wall with a hard stare that stripped away every ounce of his unearned royal privilege. "So technically, Julian, I own your castle." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Julian looked as though the blood had been siphoned from his body in seconds. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant prince who demanded my obedience moments ago was now reduced to a trembling shell of a man realizing his ancestral home belonged exclusively to the woman he just tried to command. He looked at his son not with anger, but with the cold realization that the royal lineage had produced a complete failure. Behind them, Chloe finally broke. The harsh reality shattered her last shred of carefully practiced composure. She fell heavily to her knees, hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. Her designer wedding gown pooled awkwardly around her legs in a pathetic heap of ruined silk and white tulle. She began weeping loudly, the ugly, jagged sounds of a woman mourning the brutal death of her unearned fairy tale. She had sacrificed every shred of her basic dignity, manipulated our foolish parents into massive, unrecoverable financial ruin, and lied to the entire world just to secure a crown that was effectively worthless. Now she was helplessly kneeling on the floor of a medieval castle owned by the older sister she had spent her entire miserable life tormenting. Evelyn watched her golden child weeping on the floor, and then looked back up at me, sitting effortlessly in the king's chair. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile materialistic reality to handle. She started hyperventilating, her chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked jerks. She clutched desperately at the tight collar of her rented dress, gasping for air as her wide eyes darted frantically from the fake glowing emeralds resting on the desk to the devastating financial dossier still projecting on the wall, and finally back to my calm face. "Maya, you," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. "You are a billionaire." She choked on the heavy word, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of my wealth. "Why did you not tell us? We are your family. We are blood." I slowly uncrossed my legs and leaned forward, resting my forearms casually on the smooth oak desk. I looked down at my mother, watching her scramble desperately for any emotional handhold to save herself from the impending wreckage of her own terrible decisions. I did not feel a single drop of pity or familial warmth toward her. The emotional well had run dry many years ago, leaving behind nothing but hard, polished stone. "Blood," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with a lethal dose of venom. I tilted my head, studying her pale, panicked face. "You want to talk about blood now, Evelyn? Where was this desperate need for familial connection when you told me my dark skin and natural hair would never be acceptable in high society?" Evelyn flinched as if I had struck her across the face. Marcus lowered his head, unable to meet my burning eyes. I kept my voice calm, making sure every syllable landed with maximum destructive force. "You spent my entire childhood trying to hide me away. You forced me into the basement whenever your wealthy friends visited because you thought my features were too ethnic for your shallow social climbing aesthetic. You spent thousands forcing me to chemically alter my hair and criticized every physical trait I inherited from my grandfather's side of the family. You praised Chloe's pale skin and straight hair, telling her she was destined for greatness, while assuring me I would be lucky to find a job working in the background where no one could see me." I stood up slowly, towering over the desk and the glowing green replica. I let the full weight of my commanding presence completely fill the grand royal study. "You told me repeatedly that I lacked the grace, the refinement, and the acceptable pedigree to ever sit at the tables of power. You confidently said high society would chew me up and spit me out, because I did not fit your narrow, pathetic definition of beauty or worth." I picked up my sleek iPad and tapped the screen, locking the powerful device with a soft, definitive click. I looked directly into Evelyn's terrified wide eyes, pausing for a long moment to ensure she truly understood her permanent defeat before delivering the final, absolute blow. "So tell me, guess who owns high society now?" Evelyn stared up at me, her mouth working silently as her entire universe fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. The realization that the very daughter she had deliberately hidden away, the daughter whose ethnic features she had constantly criticized, was now holding the absolute financial reins of her life, completely paralyzed her. She choked on a dry sob, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, reaching for his jacket pocket, as if throwing a few high-limit credit cards on the desk could somehow reverse $40 million in sovereign debt. "Put your hands in your pockets, Marcus," I commanded sharply, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Your accounts have been maxed out for 3 months. You do not have enough liquid capital right now to buy a cup of coffee, let alone negotiate with a global holding firm." He froze, his face draining of color as his own financial incompetence was laid bare in front of a reigning monarch. Then the atmosphere in the study shifted entirely. Prince Julian, realizing that aggressive intimidation had spectacularly failed, abruptly changed his entire tactic. It was a masterclass in survival. The furious red faded from his neck, his shoulders dropped, and the charming aristocratic smile that had initially ensnared my sister reappeared on his face. It was a terrifyingly smooth transition, revealing the absolute emptiness beneath his royal title. He stepped away from the weeping pile of white silk that was his bride-to-be and walked smoothly toward the head of the oak desk. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, projecting an aura of composed diplomatic grace. "Maya," he said, his voice dripping with sudden, practiced warmth, Clearly, there has been a massive misunderstanding here today. Emotions are running high, and terrible things have been said in the heat of the moment. He stopped just a few feet away from me, offering a smile that was entirely dead behind the eyes. We are both intelligent, business-minded people. We are family now. Let us put this unfortunate drama behind us and work together. We can combine your massive corporate assets with my historical royal title. It is a mutually beneficial partnership that will elevate us both. I looked at his outstretched hand and then back up to his perfectly symmetrical face. I reached down into my appraisal briefcase. I bypassed the magnifying loops, my fingers closing around a thick stack of legal documents I had printed directly from his private servers during my flight. I pulled the heavy sheaf of premium watermarked paper out and dropped it onto the desk right next to the glowing fake tiara. "This is the prenuptial agreement your lawyers forced my sister to sign yesterday morning," I stated flatly. Chloe lifted her head from the floor, her tear-streaked face masking profound confusion. Julian flinched, his perfect smile faltering for a fraction of a second. I picked up the document, flipping through the dense legal jargon so everyone could see the royal seal stamped on the bottom. Section 4 states that upon marriage, all assets held by the bride's immediate family, including corporate holdings, fall under the discretionary management of the royal estate. You knew exactly who I was, Julian. You researched my firm. You realized my sister was broke, but you discovered I was wealthy. You drafted a predatory legal trap designed to leverage a fake fairy tale marriage into a hostile takeover of my company. Julian opened his mouth, his charming facade beginning to crack, but I did not let him speak. I gripped the thick stack of premium legal paper with both hands, staring directly into his calculating eyes. "There is no family," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I twisted my wrists and violently ripped the entire 50-page prenuptial agreement perfectly in half right in his face. The sharp tearing sound ripped through the quiet study like a gunshot. I tossed the shredded halves into the air, letting the useless legal trap flutter down onto the polished oak desk and the Persian rug below. His mask shattered. The charming prince vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal whose survival plan had just been destroyed. His fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles cracked audibly in the room. He took a threatening step forward, his chest practically brushing against the heavy oak desk. He leaned in close, his face contorted with unvarnished aristocratic hatred. He lowered his voice, hissing a vile racial slur under his breath, a word so venomous and steeped in elitist bigotry it made the air in the room turn toxic. It was the exact same slur I had heard whispered in the hallways of the exclusive prep schools my parents had bankrupted themselves to send me to. It was undeniable proof that no matter how much money Evelyn and Marcus spent trying to assimilate, no matter how many pieces of their heritage they erased, they would never be viewed as anything more than inferior outsiders by the people they idolized. My mother heard the word clearly. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the brutal reality of the world she worshipped finally struck her across the face. I did not flinch. I just stared right back into his hateful eyes, letting his true nature expose itself completely. But I did not need to respond. A sudden blur of motion caught the corner of my eye. King Henrik, who had remained silently observing the entire devastating exchange, suddenly stepped forward with terrifying speed. His military training was instantly evident. Before Julian could pull his face away, the king raised his large, weathered hand and delivered a brutal backhand directly across his own son's face. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed like a thunderclap off the mahogany walls. Julian stumbled sideways, crashing hard into the bookshelf and gripping his rapidly swelling cheek in absolute shock. "You disgust me, Julian!" the king roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and volcanic rage. "The royal wedding is permanently cancelled." The sharp echo of the king's strike faded into the heavy velvet drapes. Julian staggered backward, clutching his rapidly swelling face. His aristocratic arrogance was completely shattered by his father's physical and verbal rejection. The prince shrank into the shadows of the antique bookshelves, utterly defeated. The grand study descended into a suffocating stillness. Evelyn watched the royal fairy tale evaporate before her eyes. Her desperate mind scrambled for a lifeline. She saw the king turning his back on her family, She saw the ruined prince. Then her frantic gaze locked onto me sitting comfortably in the monarch's leather chair. The panicked hyperventilating that had gripped her chest suddenly vanished. A terrifyingly artificial warmth flooded her perfectly powdered face. She transformed her expression, instantly burying her previous disgust under a thick layer of manufactured maternal affection. She wiped a single calculated tear from her cheek and stepped toward the heavy oak desk. Her arms reached out to me as if she were a loving mother welcoming her prodigal daughter home. "Maya, baby," she cooed, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "I always knew you were destined for incredible things. You are so smart, so capable. Please, darling, you have to save your sister's wedding. Pay off the debt. You have the money now. Just write a check and make this all go away. Show them how powerful our family is. Show the king that the Wilsons are worthy of this royal union." She moved closer, attempting to wrap her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating embrace. I did not let her touch me. I smoothly sidestepped her grasping hands, standing up from the leather chair and moving out of her reach. Her empty arms fell awkwardly to her sides. Her fake smile faltered as I looked down at her with absolute glacial detachment. "I am powerful," I stated, my voice ringing with clinical precision. "You are just a leech. You attach yourself to anyone who can elevate your pathetic social standing and drain them dry. You do not care about Chloe or her happiness. You only care about the title she was supposed to buy you. You want me to show them how powerful our family is. There is no family here, Evelyn. There is just a collection of financial parasites." Evelyn gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if I had physically wounded her. "Maya, how can you say such cruel things to your own mother? We gave you everything. We sacrificed for you." I laughed, a harsh, biting sound that sliced through her theatrical performance. "You sacrificed nothing for me. Do you really want to talk about your maternal sacrifices right now? Let us talk about my college fund. Let us talk about the $50,000 my grandmother left exclusively for my education. The money you legally controlled until my 18th birthday." I paced across the Persian rug, forcing her to turn and face me. "When I got accepted into my dream university, I came to you for the tuition check." I continued, my words striking her like physical blows. "You told me the account was completely empty. You looked me dead in the eye and said the stock market had crashed and the investments were wiped out. You told me I would have to take out predatory student loans and work 3 jobs just to survive. But that was a lie. The market never crashed. You drained my entire educational trust fund in one single week. And what did you buy with my future, Evelyn?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably by the door, but I ignored him, keeping my focus entirely on the woman who had stolen my future. "You spent every single dime of my college fund on Chloe's debutante ball. You rented out the most expensive country club in the state. You bought her a custom designer gown imported directly from Paris. You hired a 20-piece orchestra and catered a 5-course meal for 300 shallow strangers who did not even like you. And when I confronted you about the missing money, when I found the receipts in your home office, you did not even have the decency to apologize." I stopped pacing and stepped right into her personal space, forcing her to look up into my eyes. "You told me that Chloe needed the debutante ball because she actually looked the part. You told me that my sister had the right complexion, the right hair, and the right aristocratic features to attract a wealthy husband. You explicitly stated that investing in her social debut was a guaranteed return on investment, while wasting money on my education was pointless because I would never fit into high society. You stole my future to buy her a rich husband. And look exactly where that brilliant investment strategy got you. You bought a broke prince who is drowning in $40 million of toxic debt." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The sheer brutal truth of her actions stripped away her ability to play the victim. She looked at Marcus for help, but my father was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by his own complicity in the theft. "I owe you nothing," I declared, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "I do not owe you a bailout. I do not owe you a single penny of my wealth. And I certainly do not owe you a sisterly rescue mission. You gambled everything on Chloe's superficial aesthetic, and you lost entirely. You are walking out of this castle with nothing but the rented clothes on your backs and the massive predatory loans you took out to fund this fraudulent circus. From the floor, a low guttural sound began to build. Chloe had been listening to every word. The realization that I was not going to save her, that I was actively sealing her total destruction, finally snapped her fragile sanity. She had spent her entire life believing she was superior simply because our mother told her she was. Now she was kneeling in the ruins of her fake wedding, staring at the sister she had relentlessly bullied, who now held the power of a god. Chloe scrambled to her feet. The ruined white silk of her wedding dress tore audibly as she stepped on the heavy hem. Her face was contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged rage. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked completely feral. "You ruined my life!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through her throat with explosive, violent force. She did not hesitate. The desperate bride lunged directly across the room, hurling her body toward me with her hands raised. Her manicured fingers were curled into claws, aiming directly for my face. Chloe's manicured fingers never made contact with my skin. Before she could cross the final 2 feet separating us, the heavy oak doors burst open. The 2 royal guards stationed outside had been watching the escalating scene with vigilant focus. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed. A blur of dark green uniforms and polished brass intercepted my sister mid-flight. The lead guard hit Chloe with a textbook tackle, driving his shoulder directly into her midsection. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs in a sharp, violent wheeze. She slammed into the Persian rug with a sickening thud. The layers of her exorbitant silk wedding gown crumpled beneath the heavy combat boots of the guards. They did not care that she was wearing a custom-imported dress or that she was supposed to be the future princess. They grabbed her flailing arms and pinned them firmly behind her back, pushing her face directly into the woven wool of the carpet. Chloe thrashed wildly, her legs kicking out in a desperate, uncoordinated frenzy, but the guards held her down with effortless, overwhelming force. The glittering crystal hairpins she had spent hours arranging shattered against the floor, scattering like cheap glass across the room. The sheer physical reality of the brutal takedown echoed loudly in the cavernous private study, completely destroying the illusion of her manufactured royal elegance. She was no longer a beautiful bride waiting for her prince. She was just an exposed fraud screaming helplessly against the floorboards as the undeniable truth of her situation finally caught up to her. "Get your hands off my daughter, Marcus!" bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and residual arrogance. The sight of his precious golden child pinned to the ground by armed security finally snapped him out of his paralyzed stupor. He lunged forward, attempting to physically pull the massive guard off Chloe's back, but the second guard simply raised a heavy baton, pressing the solid metal directly against Marcus' chest. My father stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. He turned his furious, desperate eyes toward King Henrik. "This is an absolute outrage," Marcus screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the monarch. "You cannot treat us this way. We are American citizens. I will ruin you for this. I will call the embassy immediately. I will hire the best international lawyers money can buy, and I will sue this entire royal estate for assault, false imprisonment, and emotional distress. You will lose this castle and everything you own by the time I am finished with you." He was puffing his chest out, trying to project a dominant alpha male persona that had bullied small-town contractors and intimidated passive neighbors for decades. He genuinely believed that screaming loud enough and threatening continuous, endless litigation could eventually bend reality to his will. He thought he could manipulate the king just as easily as he manipulated his own employees back in America. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated with a series of urgent banking notifications I had set up earlier that morning. I did not even look at my father, as I tapped the screen, opening the detailed financial alerts tracking his remaining liquid assets. "Sue him with what money, Dad?" I asked, my voice slicing through his hysterical rant with absolute clinical precision. I held the phone up so the bright screen faced him. "I just got an alert directly from the holding company managing your remaining debt. Your last functioning credit card, the one under Evelyn's maiden name, just declined for the hotel rooms you booked for your fancy wedding guests. He froze, his mouth still open, but no sound coming out. The anger drained from his face, leaving behind a hollow gray mask of pure terror. You cannot even afford a taxi to the airport right now. I continued, stepping around the heavy oak desk to stand directly in front of him. You mortgaged your primary residence, you drained your retirement, and you took out high-interest predatory loans just to fly here and play pretend. You are functionally bankrupt. You do not have the funds to hire a local traffic attorney, let alone an international legal team to fight the king. I watched his shoulders slump as the crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally crushed his delusional ego. For years you lectured me about financial responsibility while you secretly burned through our family stability just to fund Chloe's shallow social ambitions. You are broke, Marcus. You are completely, entirely broke. There is no hidden account waiting to save you. There is no secret benefactor. You have literally nothing left to your entire name right now. Evelyn let out a high-pitched, keening wail, burying her face in her hands. She was mourning the permanent loss of her country club status, the absolute end of her social climbing dreams. Chloe stopped thrashing under the guards, realizing that no one was coming to save her. She lay with her cheek pressed against the rug, her ruined makeup staining the expensive fabric, weeping quietly in total defeat. Julian remained cowering against the bookshelves, a silent coward watching the family he tried to scam get completely dismantled by the very woman he had dismissed as a background player. King Henrik observed the pathetic wreckage of the Wilson family with undisguised contempt. He stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His gaze swept over my father, my weeping mother, and my sister pinned to the floor. You came into my home and attempted to defraud my legacy. The king said, his voice vibrating with absolute sovereign authority. You are nothing but common thieves wrapped in rented finery. The monarch turned his sharp, commanding gaze to the royal guards still holding Chloe against the floor. Escort this fraudulent family to the service exit, he ordered, his cold tone leaving zero room for negotiation or delay. Throw them out onto the street where they truly belong. The heavy leather boots of the royal guards thudded against the hardwood floor, executing the king's command with ruthless military precision. Guards seized Marcus by the arms, hauling him upward with enough force to pop the seams of his rented jacket. He flailed his legs, slipping awkwardly on the wood as his false bravado evaporated. Another guard grabbed Evelyn by the elbows, lifting her forcefully from her dramatic weeping crouch. Her high heels scraped loudly against the floorboards as she struggled to find her footing. The shock of being physically manhandled, like common trespassers rather than aristocratic guests, completely short-circuited their minds. They dragged them backward toward the towering arched doorways of the study. Evelyn twisted her neck wildly, her perfectly coiffed hair falling into her tear-streaked face. Her frantic eyes locked onto me as I stood beside the grand oak desk. The maternal warmth she weaponized moments ago morphed into terror. Maya, please! Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as her heels dragged across the Persian rug. You cannot let them do this to us. We are your parents. We have absolutely nowhere to go. Marcus stopped trying to wrestle with the guards and joined his wife's pathetic chorus. His face was purple with exertion and panic. Maya listened to reason, he begged, his voice cracking under the physical strain of the guard's grip. You have to help us. We maxed out every single account for this wedding. We took a second mortgage on the house. We have no cash. We do not even have our return flights booked because we assumed the royal family would charter a jet for us. You have to write us a check. Just give us enough to get back to America. You are rich now. It is nothing to you. I stepped away from the desk, smoothing my tailored suit. I walked slowly, keeping pace with them as the guards hauled them backward toward the exit. I looked into their desperate, panicked faces and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual familial loyalty, just the cold, clean satisfaction of inevitable justice. You want me to fund your journey home? I asked, my voice ringing loud and clear in the echoing study. I tilted my head. That is incredibly fascinating, Marcus. Because I distinctly remember a time when I was the one stranded at an airport. I remember flying back from Tokyo after closing my first major acquisition. I had been awake for 30 hours. I was exhausted, freezing, and carrying heavy luggage. I messaged the family group chat asking for a simple ride from the terminal. Do you remember what you told me, Evelyn? Evelyn choked on a sob, trying to pull away from the guard's grip. Maya, please, this is different, she gasped. It is not different, I interrupted sharply, my voice snapping like a whip. It is exactly the same. You read my message and you replied that you were too busy touring a country club venue for Chloe's engagement party. You told me to try Uber. You dismissed my basic need for a safe ride home because catering to Chloe's fake royal aesthetic was your only priority. You left me standing on a curb in the rain while you drank champagne on my stolen college fund. I stepped closer to them as they reached the heavy brass handles of the study doors. I leaned in, ensuring they heard my words. So I suggest you take your own brilliant maternal advice, Evelyn. Go try Uber. Oh, wait. I tapped my chin. I forgot about the alert I just showed you. Your credit cards are completely declined. You cannot even order an Uber. You are in a foreign country with zero liquid capital, canceled credit limits, and absolutely no safety net. You will walk out of these gates in rented formal wear and face the streets exactly as you are. Broke, desperate, and entirely alone. Marcus let out a pathetic whimpering sound completely broken by his financial destruction. He sagged against the guards, giving up his physical struggle entirely. The guards shoved the heavy doors open, the corridor light spilling into the dim study. They pushed my parents out into the hallway. Behind them, 2 more guards hauled Chloe up from the floor. She was a devastating sight. The front of her custom silk wedding gown was ripped and stained with dust from the carpet. Her makeup was a ruined, smeared mess of black mascara and foundation. The fake diamond tiara was hanging sideways in her tangled hair. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as the guards dragged her past the bookshelves. Her frantic eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for any remaining lifeline. Her gaze bypassed me completely and locked onto the shadows near the corner. Julian stepped slightly into the light, rubbing his bruised jaw. He looked at my sister with a mixture of profound annoyance and utter disgust. He was no longer the charming prince who had whispered sweet promises into her ear. He was a cornered scam artist who had just lost his final paycheck. Chloe reached out a shaking hand toward him, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate plea. Julian, she sobbed, the sound echoing pitifully in the large room. Julian, please, you love me, right? You said I was going to be your princess. Tell them to stop. Tell them we are getting married. The prince did not flinch. He did not offer a comforting word or a sympathetic glance. He looked down at the ruined, weeping girl who had bankrupted her entire family just to stand next to him. He hawked loudly, clearing his throat, and spat directly at her feet. The glob of saliva hit the polished wood floor mere inches from her expensive white shoes. He turned his back and walked away into the deep shadows of the study, abandoning her. Chloe's devastating scream shattered the silence as the heavy oak doors finally slammed shut behind them. The heavy oak doors sealed shut, cutting off the frantic, hysterical screams of my mother and the pathetic sobbing of my sister. The sudden silence in the grand study was absolute, ringing in my ears like a physical force. The chaotic energy that had just consumed the room completely evaporated, leaving behind the scent of expensive floor wax and the faint, lingering smell of Chloe's ruined floral perfume. I stood near the edge of the Persian rug, taking a slow, measured breath to steady my adrenaline. The royal takedown was complete, but the air in the room remained thick with unresolved tension. King Henrik remained near the antique bookshelves. He ran a weathered hand over his face, suddenly looking every bit of his advanced age. The commanding monarch who had just violently struck his own son and banished an entire family now looked profoundly exhausted. He gestured sharply to the remaining 2 royal guards standing at attention by the exit. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. The guards bowed simultaneously, their boots clicking in perfect unison as they exited through a side door, leaving me entirely alone with the sovereign. Henrik walked slowly toward the massive oak desk. He did not sit in his oversized leather chair. Instead, he leaned heavily against the polished wood, crossing his arms and looking directly at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply acknowledged the utter devastation that had just occurred within the walls of his private sanctuary. Maya the king began, his tone stripped of all royal pretense and diplomatic polish. I owe you a profound apology, not just as a monarch, but as a father. I knew Julian was entitled. I knew he was financially reckless and overly fond of his own reflection. But the profound depth of his deceit, his sheer predatory cruelty toward your family, and that vile slur he used today. Henrik shook his head, closing his eyes briefly as a look of genuine disgust crossed his features. I am deeply ashamed of the man my son has become. You handled him with exactly the amount of ruthless precision he deserved. I met his gaze, holding my head high. Your son attempted to weaponize a fake fairy tale to steal my company, Your Majesty. He underestimated me because he assumed I was as blinded by proximity to power as my parents were. I deal in hard assets and verified appraisals. I do not deal in fantasies, and I do not tolerate parasites. The king offered a small, tired smile. No, you certainly do not. You deal in reality. He pushed himself off the desk, taking a step closer to my appraisal briefcase still resting on the polished surface. Speaking of hard assets and verified reality, I must admit something. This entire disastrous engagement began because Julian brought me photographs of a supposedly priceless artifact. He claimed your family possessed an heirloom that rivaled our own crown jewels. I know the piece resting on this desk is a cheap replica, but I also know a woman of your meticulous intellect would not travel across the globe empty-handed. He looked at me with genuine, intense curiosity. If you are willing, Maya, I would very much like to see the real heirloom. I looked at the king, measuring his sincerity. He was not asking out of greed or aristocratic entitlement. He was asking out of profound respect for history and undeniable curiosity. I nodded slowly. I walked over to the desk and pulled my heavy appraisal briefcase toward me. I bypassed the main metallic clasps entirely. I ran my fingers along the reinforced steel bottom, finding the microscopic seam hidden within the metal framework. I pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner built directly into the casing. A soft mechanical click echoed in the quiet room as the false bottom disengaged. I slid the heavy hidden compartment open, revealing a custom molded velvet interior. Resting inside, catching the ambient light of the study, was not a delicate European tiara. It was a solid, heavy crown of pure, unrefined gold, embedded with emeralds the size of quail eggs. The gems were not cut into modern geometric facets. They were raw, polished smooth by hand, radiating a deep, hypnotic green fire that seemed to pulse with ancient, formidable energy. The sheer weight and historical gravity of the piece made the royal surroundings suddenly look cheap and manufactured by comparison. I lifted the heavy crown with both hands, setting it gently on the oak desk, directly next to Chloe's discarded glowing fake. King Henrik inhaled sharply, stepping forward as if pulled by an invisible magnetic force. He did not touch it, but hovered his hands over the raw emeralds, his eyes wide with absolute reverence. Good God, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. The craftsmanship, the absolute purity of the stones. This is not a European design. Where on earth did this come from? It was given to my great-grandmother by an African king. Before colonization, I explained, my voice ringing with generations of unyielding pride. My family did not acquire our wealth by marrying into European titles or pretending to be something we are not. My great-grandmother was a master trader, a woman who built her own trade routes across the continent. She negotiated directly with warlords and monarchs. She earned this crown through brilliant, ruthless commerce. I traced a finger over the smooth surface of the largest emerald. My parents spent their entire lives running away from their true heritage, trying to bleach their history to fit into rooms exactly like this one. They hid this remarkable crown in a dark vault because they thought it was too ethnic, too unrefined for high society. They wanted to trade real indigenous royalty for a fake modern fairy tale. But I know exactly what true power looks like. King Henrik stared at the raw emeralds for a long time before slowly lifting his gaze to meet mine. The exhaustion in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating brilliance. He looked at me not as a prospective in-law or a foreign guest, but as a true, formidable equal. Maya, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. You just saved my kingdom from a disastrous marriage and exposed a massive, catastrophic vulnerability in my own financial management. My son is a fool, and my current advisors are clearly incompetent. He leaned forward, resting his large hands firmly on the desk. I am firing the entire board of the Royal Sovereign Wealth Fund tomorrow morning. I want you to take over. I want you to manage my empire. The king did not wait for my immediate response. He walked toward a crystal decanter on a silver tray near the arched windows. The amber liquid splashed against the heavy glass as he poured 2 generous measures of aged scotch. He turned back, handing one of the crystal tumblers directly to me. I took it, noting the absolute steadiness of his hand. He operated with the calm precision of a seasoned general executing a necessary battlefield amputation. My son spent a decade bleeding our sovereign wealth dry. Henrik stated, his voice devoid of paternal sentiment. He financed his extravagant lifestyle by quietly liquidating our lesser-known historical assets. The fake tiara your sister wore today is just a symptom of a much larger rot. The royal treasury is hemorrhaging capital because I trusted blood over competence. He took a slow sip, letting the harsh reality settle in the quiet study. I need someone who understands the true value of history and the ruthless mechanics of modern commerce. I need someone who cannot be charmed, bullied, or manipulated. I am offering you a permanent seat on the Royal Council of Antiquities. I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, watching the emerald crown reflect in the crystal. A permanent seat on the council, I echoed, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. You have dozens of European scholars and aristocratic historians on that payroll. They will not take kindly to an American outsider suddenly dictating their national heritage. They will take kindly to whatever I command them to accept, the king countered sharply. But the council seat is merely the foundation. I am offering you the primary contract to completely overhaul and restore the National Museum of Sovereign History. It is a massive undertaking. The contract itself is worth $30 million up front. You will have absolute operational control over our archives, our global exhibitions, and the commercial licensing of our entire national collection. You will rebuild our financial stability using the very artifacts my foolish son tried to squander. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. The burn matched the sudden fierce heat of ambition flaring in my chest. $30 million was a staggering sum. It was enough to catapult my appraisal firm into the highest echelons of global finance. It was enough to permanently crush any remaining leverage my parents thought they could ever wield against me. But I was not the scared college student begging for tuition money anymore. I was a woman holding a crown forged by an African king, and I knew exactly how to leverage power. $30 million is a generous initial consulting fee. Your Majesty, I replied, setting my glass down next to the glowing emeralds. But I do not work for flat rates. If I am going to single-handedly restructure your entire sovereign wealth portfolio and resurrect a failing national museum, I require an ongoing equity stake in the revenue I generate. King Henrik lowered his glass, his eyes narrowing slightly. You are asking for a percentage of the Royal Museum profits. I am demanding it. I corrected my voice, carrying the same lethal calm I had used to dismantle my sister. You just admitted your son liquidated your assets. You admitted your current advisors are incompetent. You are coming to me because I am the only person in this room who understands how to monetize history without destroying its soul. I will curate the exhibitions. I will handle the international licensing. I will negotiate the global touring rights for your restored artifacts. But in exchange for securing your financial legacy, I want 60% of the gross profit rights from the museum and all associated commercial ventures in perpetuity. The king choked out a harsh, incredulous laugh. 60%, he repeated, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. That is an absolutely outrageous demand. You are asking for the lion's share of a national institution. I am offering you a prestigious title and a fortune, and you are trying to hold a monarch hostage. I leaned forward, planting both hands firmly on the desk, leaning over the ancient African crown. I am not holding you hostage, Henrik. I am offering you a lifeline. You can reject my terms. You can hand the museum back to the same aristocratic fools who let Julian steal you blind. You can watch your kingdom slowly slide into bankruptcy while you cling to your pride. Or you can sign over 60% of the profits to a ruthless businesswoman who will guarantee your kingdom remains financially bulletproof for the next century. My great-grandmother did not build her empire by accepting the first offer she was handed. Neither do I. The silence that followed was suffocating. The king stared at me, his jaw clenched tight. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience. He was used to people bowing, scraping, and accepting whatever scraps he deemed fit to toss from his table. But he was also a survivor. He looked at the fake tiara discarded on the floor. He looked at the magnificent emerald crown resting on his desk. He saw the undeniable difference between cheap illusions and solid, enduring reality. A slow, genuine smile finally broke through his hardened features. He set his empty glass down on the silver tray and buttoned his suit jacket. He shook his head, entirely amused by the sheer audacity of my counteroffer. "You are a terrifying woman, Maya," he said, his voice laced with profound respect. "You just watched a royal family implode, you destroyed your own parents, and now you are aggressively pillaging my treasury without batting an eye. You do not just understand power, you consume it." "Do we have a deal, Your Majesty?" I asked, refusing to break eye contact. King Henrik stepped around the heavy oak desk, stopping directly in front of me. He extended his large, weathered hand. "You are a queen in your own right, Maya," he declared. "We have a deal." I gripped the king's hand, firmly sealing the 60% profit rights and cementing my absolute victory. His handshake was solid, the grip of a man who finally recognized true leverage. Leaving the cavernous study, I walked through the opulent marble corridors of the royal estate. The heavy silence of the castle interior felt entirely different now. It was no longer a stage built for Chloe's delusional fairy tale. It was my newly acquired asset. I bypassed the bewildered palace staff and descended the grand sweeping staircase toward the main entrance. The heavy mahogany front doors were pulled open by two silent guards, and the immediate roar of a torrential downpour assaulted my ears. The sky had cracked open, unleashing a violent, relentless storm across the sprawling estate. I stepped out beneath the massive stone portico, perfectly shielded from the driving rain. The scene playing out beyond the wrought iron gates of the royal courtyard was a masterpiece of absolute humiliation. My parents and my sister had been literally thrown out into the mud. The pristine cobblestone driveway ended at the security perimeter, where the manicured lawns dissolved into rain-slicked earth. Chloe, Evelyn, and Marcus were huddled together in the freezing downpour, completely exposed to the elements. Chloe's ruined silk wedding gown was now soaked through, clinging to her shivering frame and dragging through the thick brown sludge. The cheap rented tuxedo Marcus wore was plastered to his skin, completely ruining his manufactured alpha male silhouette. They were not alone in the mud. The royal security team had deliberately leaked the cancellation of the engagement to the press corps waiting outside. Dozens of ruthless international paparazzi who had been camped out for days, expecting to photograph a glorious royal wedding, were now swarming the disgraced American family like bloodthirsty vultures. The heavy iron gates were locked tight behind my family, trapping them in the flashbulb crossfire. Camera shutters fired relentlessly, illuminating the dark, stormy afternoon with blinding stroboscopic lightning. Microphones were shoved aggressively into their faces. "Look this way, fake bride," one photographer shouted, his voice cutting through the heavy rain. "Give us a smile for the bankruptcy courts." Another journalist shoved a camera directly into Evelyn's weeping face. "Is it true you maxed out your credit cards for a fake royal title? Where is the prince? Did he dump you because your family is entirely broke?" Chloe tried to hide her face behind her muddy hands, but the paparazzi were merciless. They circled her, snapping thousands of high-definition photos of her smeared makeup and ruined tiara. This was exactly what my mother and sister had always wanted. Throughout my entire childhood, Evelyn had stolen my savings to pay for Chloe's elite etiquette classes and expensive photo shoots. Chloe had spent countless hours practicing her royal wave in the mirror, wearing designer clothes bought with my hijacked credit. They craved global attention and unearned social validation above all else. Now they finally had the undivided attention of the international press. The cameras were permanently documenting the absolute destruction of their fake aristocratic facade. "Are those diamonds real, or did you rent the tiara too?" a reporter jeered, shoving a microphone toward Chloe's trembling chin. "Leave us alone!" Evelyn shrieked, batting her hands wildly at the flashing cameras. "We are VIP guests. You cannot treat us like this. We demand respect." The press corps erupted in cruel, mocking laughter. Marcus attempted to shove a particularly aggressive photographer away, but his slick leather dress shoes lost traction in the thick mud. He slipped and landed hard on his knees, sending a spray of dirty water across his rented shirt. The paparazzi enthusiastically documented his fall, snapping dozens of pictures of the so-called wealthy patriarch kneeling in the dirt. "I will sue all of you!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I will buy your publications and fire every single one of you." "With what money?" a journalist yelled back from the crowd. "We heard your credit cards just declined at the local hotel. You cannot even afford an umbrella." Marcus did not have the breath left to scream his usual hollow threats. He just stayed on his knees in the freezing rain, while Evelyn wailed helplessly beside him. The pristine image of the wealthy, successful Wilson family was being broadcast live to the entire world as a pathetic, bankrupt joke. They had sacrificed my future to build an illusion, and now the illusion was crushing them. Through the relentless downpour, a sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly up the private driveway. It bypassed the chaotic media circus outside the gates entirely, using the secure royal access lane. The heavy vehicle pulled to a silent stop directly in front of the stone portico where I stood. My personal driver, Thomas, a man I had hired during my first major successful acquisition, stepped out immediately. He opened a massive black umbrella, shielding me completely from the storm as he opened the rear passenger door. The plush cream leather interior glowed warmly in the damp gray afternoon. I stepped into the luxurious warmth of the vehicle, settling into the pristine leather seats. The contrast between my current reality and the miserable scene playing out at the front gates was absolute. I had built my empire in the shadows, working 80-hour weeks, while they mocked my ambition and stole my resources. Now the results of our respective choices were on full public display. I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar vehicle finalizing a sovereign wealth contract, while they were literally rolling in the mud. As Thomas closed my door and slid into the driver's seat, the royal guards pressed the button to slowly open the main iron gates. The Rolls-Royce glided forward, the engine purring silently as we approached the mob of photographers and my shivering family. The paparazzi scrambled out of the way, parting like the Red Sea for the imposing luxury vehicle. Marcus, Evelyn, and Chloe stood frozen in the mud, staring at the tinted windows of the car. They knew exactly who was inside. As Thomas navigated the car smoothly through the gauntlet of flashing cameras, I reached over and pressed the button. I rolled down the window. The glass slid down with a nearly silent electric hum, letting the furious roar of the storm and the chaotic shouting of the paparazzi instantly flood the pristine, quiet cabin of the Rolls-Royce. The biting, cold wind whipped rain across my face, but I did not blink. Seeing the window lower, Evelyn lunged forward like a drowning woman spotting a life raft. She shoved her way past two cursing photographers, slipping wildly in the mud before slamming her hands against the polished door of my car. Her appearance was a shocking departure from the meticulously curated country club matriarch I had known my entire life. Her expensive styling was completely eradicated. Rain plastered her thinning hair flat against her skull. Dark streams of ruined mascara ran down her cheeks, mixing with the mud splattered across her face. "Maya, please!" Evelyn wailed, her voice shrill and broken, barely audible over the relentless clicking of camera shutters. "Let us in, Maya. Open the door. We will freeze out here. You cannot leave us like this." Behind her, Marcus stood paralyzed in the deluge. The cold water soaked completely through his rented tuxedo, making him look small and severely deflated. He did not even have the energy to command me anymore. He just stared at the luxurious leather interior of my car with vacant, terrified eyes. Chloe was shivering violently, hugging her ruined silk wedding dress around her shoulders, her teeth chattering so hard I could hear it over the sound of the rain. She looked like a drowned rat stripped of her fake tiara and her manufactured royal entitlement. The paparazzi swarmed around them, relentless in their pursuit of the perfect disastrous photograph. They shoved microphones past my mother, screaming questions about their bankruptcy and the fake royal wedding. I looked down at my mother. Her manicured fingers were desperately clutching the edge of the window frame, leaving muddy streaks on the pristine glass. I felt a profound sense of detachment. There was no anger left in my chest. There was only the cold, hard reality of consequence. "You want to come inside, Evelyn?" I asked, my voice projecting a terrifying calm that silenced the closest photographers. "That is a very interesting request, considering how hard you work to keep me entirely out of sight." Evelyn opened her mouth to sob another excuse, but I cut her off sharply. "For my entire life, you made it abundantly clear that I did not belong in your perfect family portrait. You hid me away during your country club dinners. You left me off the guest list for your high society charity galas. You sat in our living room and told me to my face that I was a complete embarrassment." I leaned closer to the open window, letting the freezing rain hit my tailored suit jacket. "Do you remember the exact words you used when I asked why I was excluded from Chloe's extravagant engagement party back in Boston? You stood in the kitchen pouring yourself a glass of wine, and you said I was socially unfit. You said my obsession with building my business instead of finding a wealthy husband made me an awkward liability. You told me my presence would humiliate the family in front of Julian and his high-profile relatives. You said I lacked the grace required to mingle with the absolute elite." Evelyn shook her head frantically, her wet hair slapping against her cheeks. "I did not mean it, Maya. I was just stressed about the wedding. You are my daughter." I gestured toward the flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, and the locked iron gates of the towering stone castle. "We'll take a good look around, Evelyn. This is the high-profile elite society you sacrificed my college fund and your own dignity to impress. You mortgaged your home and drained your retirement accounts to buy your way into a world that only respects hard assets and absolute leverage. You worshipped this aristocratic illusion. You thought you could fake your way to the top by putting a rented crown on your golden child and destroying anyone who got in your way." I locked eyes with her, ensuring she felt the full weight of her destruction. "But real power does not care about your rented clothes or your manufactured pedigree. It only cares about what you actually own, and you own absolutely nothing. Looks like the elite society you worshipped just chewed you up and spat you out." Evelyn sobbed harder, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the window frame. "We are your family, Maya. You have to save us. Please, we have no money. We cannot even get a hotel. You have $30 million now." I heard the king. "You have to help your mother." Marcus finally found a fraction of his voice stumbling forward in the mud. "Maya, you listen to me right now." He started attempting to project his old authoritative tone, but it cracked pitifully. "You cannot abandon your own flesh and blood in a foreign country. It is illegal. It is immoral. I will not allow it." I shifted my gaze to my father, looking at him with absolute sovereign disdain. "You abandoned me emotionally, financially, and entirely the day you decided my only purpose was to fund Chloe's shallow ambitions. You stole from me to finance this exact disaster. You are not my family, Marcus. You are simply a bad investment that I have finally liquidated." I turned my attention back to Evelyn, who was now weeping hysterically and trying to reach her hand inside the vehicle to grab my arm. I did not flinch. I did not move away. I simply looked her dead in the eyes and pressed the chrome button on my armrest. The thick, bulletproof glass began to rise with a smooth, powerful electric hum. Evelyn shrieked, yanking her fingers back just before the window sealed shut completely, cutting off her frantic screaming. The sound of the storm and the chaotic shouting of the paparazzi were instantly muted, turning into a dull background thrum. I watched through the rain-streaked glass as Evelyn pounded her fists against the window, her face twisted in absolute despair. Chloe sank to her knees in the mud next to her, completely defeated, while Marcus stood shivering and ruined in the relentless downpour. I settled back into the plush leather seat, brushing a single drop of rainwater from my lapel. I looked straight ahead at the long, winding road leading away from the castle. "Drive, Thomas," I said, my voice perfectly steady. The heavy luxury car accelerated smoothly, pulling away from the curb and leaving the shattered remains of the Wilson family behind in the mud and the flashing lights. 1 month later, the torrential rain of that European afternoon felt like a lifetime away. I sat perfectly still in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of my private restoration laboratory in downtown Manhattan. The only sound in the secure facility was the soft hum of the humidifiers and the precise scrape of my scalpel against hardened centuries-old clay. I leaned over the magnification light, carefully lifting a layer of calcified dirt from the rim of a 17th-century gold chalice. The artifact was part of King Henrik's newly acquired touring exhibition, and I held absolute global rights to its display. My assistant Sarah walked briskly into the lab, holding a steaming cup of black tea in one hand and her sleek silver tablet in the other. She set the tea down on a safe metal coaster near my workstation and tapped the screen of her device. She knew better than to interrupt my focus during a delicate extraction, but our morning briefing was a strict daily protocol. "We have the final numbers from the Geneva exhibition launch," Sarah announced, her voice echoing slightly off the white walls. Ticket sales broke the previous museum record by 40%. The European press is calling your curation a monumental renaissance for the sovereign wealth portfolio. I kept my eyes fixed through the magnification lens, carefully sweeping away a final speck of dust. "Good," I replied, setting the scalpel down on a velvet cloth. "Ensure the London venue is prepared to handle the overflow capacity. What is the domestic news?" Sarah swiped her finger across the tablet, scrolling through the International Morning Digest. She paused, a small, satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. "The Royal Palace officially released the decree an hour ago. King Henrik has formally stripped Julian of all his royal titles and succession rights. He has been permanently exiled from the National Trust and given a meager monthly stipend on the condition he never speaks to the press. He is currently hiding out in a cheap flat in Monaco." I removed my protective gloves and picked up my tea, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Julian had gambled his entire royal future on a desperate attempt to liquidate his heritage, and he had lost absolutely everything. He traded an empire for a cheap illusion and paid the ultimate price. "And the Wilsons?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely clinical. Sarah tapped the screen again, bringing up a live feed from a financial news network. "They are scheduled to appear in Manhattan Federal Bankruptcy Court at noon today," she reported, reading the rolling ticker. "Creditors seized the Springfield estate yesterday. The bank froze all their remaining accounts, and the luxury car leasing company repossessed Marcus and Evelyn's vehicles. They are completely insolvent, Maya." I walked over to the large glass window overlooking the bustling Manhattan skyline. My parents had built their entire identity on the perception of limitless wealth. They had crushed my ambitions to fund Chloe's fairy tale, and now they were facing the ultimate humiliation of public financial ruin. They had nothing left to leverage and no one left to exploit. Marcus tried to sell an exclusive tell-all story to the tabloids last night. Sarah continued, her tone laced with professional disdain. "He called 3 different gossip magazines, promising them the inside scoop on the royal wedding disaster and how you allegedly sabotaged the family." I turned away from the window, raising an eyebrow. "And let me guess, no one bought it." "No one even offered him a meeting," Sarah confirmed, laughing softly. "The narrative is already locked. Your exclusive feature in Vogue dropped 2 weeks ago and completely dominated the global conversation. You framed the entire situation perfectly. The dignified, independent American art curator who saved a European national museum from a rogue prince. You did not even mention your parents or Chloe by name. You just made them completely irrelevant." The tabloids do not care about a bankrupt, desperate man trying to slander his wildly successful billionaire daughter. The public already chose their queen. I nodded, setting the empty teacup down on the counter. The Vogue interview had been a calculated masterstroke. I had refused to engage in petty mudslinging or emotional family drama. I simply presented myself as the savior of the royal archive, focusing entirely on the artifacts, the history, and the $30 million contract I had secured. By refusing to acknowledge Evelyn, Marcus, or Chloe, I starved them of the oxygen they craved. They wanted a public war to stay relevant, and I had handed them absolute suffocating silence. They were not victims or villains in my story. They were simply a bad investment that I had written off and forgotten. Clear my schedule for the afternoon, I instructed Sarah, returning to the workstation and pulling my protective gloves back on. I want to finish the restoration on this chalice before the board meeting tomorrow morning. Sarah nodded, tapping the confirmation into her tablet. Understood. I will hold all non-essential calls. As she turned to leave the secure lab, the harsh electronic buzzing of my personal cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere. I kept my private number strictly limited to high-level clients and emergency contacts. I walked over to my desk and picked up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying an unknown local New York number. I stared at the flashing screen for a moment, my intuition flaring. I rarely answered unknown numbers, but something told me this was not a business call. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "This is Maya." A sharp, ragged breath echoed through the speaker, followed by the distinct sound of frantic weeping. The background noise was chaotic, filled with the honking of taxi horns and the loud roar of city traffic. "Maya," the voice sobbed, raw and trembling with panic. "Maya, please do not hang up." It was simply my sister Chloe. Her breathing was ragged, catching in her throat as she choked on her own tears. Behind her frantic sobbing, I could hear a distinct, jarring symphony of sounds. The rhythmic electronic beeping of a commercial deep fryer, the harsh static of a cheap intercom system, the muffled, impatient voice of a customer demanding extra ketchup. The background noise painted a vivid, undeniable picture of exactly where my former royal sister had ended up. "Maya, please," Chloe begged, her voice cracking under the weight of sheer desperation. "I know you hate me. I know I deserve it, but you have to listen. I am sleeping in a motel that smells like bleach and cheap cigarettes. I am wearing a hideous polyester uniform that reeks of stale grease. They make me clean the fry traps, Maya. The shift manager screams at me if I take an extra minute on my mandated break. I cannot survive like this. I was supposed to be a princess. I was supposed to live in a palace." I held the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes fixed on the gleaming gold chalice resting on my velvet work mat. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no surge of vindictive pleasure. There was no lingering resentment. The burning anger that had fueled my 80-hour work weeks and ruthless corporate negotiations had completely evaporated. Looking at the priceless 17th century artifact, I realized Chloe was exactly like the dirt I had painstakingly scraped away. She was an obsolete layer of grime that no longer mattered to the masterpiece beneath. Mom and Dad lost the house. Chloe wailed, her panic escalating as a loud, aggressive buzzer went off somewhere in her immediate vicinity. The bank took everything we had. The country club permanently canceled their membership and blacklisted them. Mom is sleeping on Aunt Martha's pull-out couch, and Dad is working the night shift at a hardware supply store. They have absolutely nothing left to give me. You are the only one who made it out. You are a billionaire, Maya. You won the game. I see now that you were the best of us. You always were. The manipulative flattery was so transparent it was almost insulting. She was using the exact same syrupy tone she used to employ when begging our parents to dip into my college fund for her designer handbags. She expected me to crumble at the first sign of familial submission. She assumed my lifelong craving for parental validation and sisterly affection would override my hard-earned common sense. She thought throwing around empty compliments would instantly erase decades of targeted systematic abuse. I remained perfectly still, letting her hollow praise hang in the sterile air of my laboratory. I did not interrupt her. I let her listen to the cold, deafening silence on my end of the line. Maya, are you there? Chloe asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Please just send me a little money or give me a job at your museum. I will do anything you ask. I will fetch your coffee. I will answer your phones and clean your floors. Just get me out of this drive-through window. I am begging you on my hands and knees. We are blood, Maya. You cannot leave your own sister rotting in a fast food kitchen. Another voice cut through the background static on her end. It was a sharp, aggressive managerial bark demanding to know why the drive-through lane was backed up to the street. Chloe let out a muffled whimper, apologizing frantically to whoever was yelling at her before returning her attention to the phone. Please, Maya, she pleaded again, the sound of a plastic headset rustling heavily against her hair. I picked up my scalpel, rotating it slowly under the bright magnification light. You are not sorry you hurt me, Chloe? I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, absolute calm. You are not experiencing a sudden moral awakening. You are not reflecting on the decades you spent participating in my emotional destruction. You did not call me to apologize when you were flying private to Monaco. You did not call me to make amends when you were picking out a $250,000 wedding dress funded by massive financial fraud. But Maya, I was brainwashed by Mom and Dad. Chloe cried desperately, trying to shift the blame to our ruined parents. They made me do it. They told me I was special. You enjoyed every single second of it, I countered, shutting down her pathetic excuse with surgical precision. You loved watching them tear me down because it made you feel superior. You loved stealing my resources because you believed you were inherently more valuable than I was. You never once looked at me as a sister. You looked at me as a bank account and a convenient stepping stone. You are only crying right now because your massive scam failed on a global stage. You are not sorry you destroyed our family. You are just sorry you lost your prince and your money. A heavy, suffocating pause settled over the line. For the first time in her pampered, sheltered life, Chloe had absolutely no counter-argument. The undeniable truth of her own toxic superficiality had finally cornered her. She let out a choked, pathetic gasp, fully realizing that her lifelong safety net had been permanently severed. There would be no rescue. There would be no redemption arc. Do not call this number again. I stated, my tone entirely devoid of empathy or malice. Enjoy your shift. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring the frantic screeching that erupted from the tiny speaker. With one precise motion, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I immediately opened my settings, selected her unknown number, and engaged the permanent block feature. The screen went dark, cutting off her access to my life forever. I set the phone face down on the stainless steel counter and picked up my magnification glasses. I looked out the massive window one last time at the sprawling Manhattan skyline, absorbing the sheer magnitude of what I had successfully built. I had spent my entire youth wishing for revenge, dreaming of the day I could scream at them and make them feel the pain they had inflicted upon me. But true victory did not require screaming. It did not require throwing mud or seeking apologies from people who were fundamentally incapable of genuine remorse. The ultimate power was not anger. The ultimate power was pure, unadulterated indifference. They simply did not matter anymore. I turned my attention back to the 17th century gold chalice, resting under the bright halogen lights. I carefully positioned my scalpel against the delicate ancient metal, ready to uncover the next layer of enduring, brilliant history. 6 months later, the meticulous scraping of that scalpel gave way to the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the sophisticated murmur of the international elite. I stood at the center of the grand rotunda of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. King Henrik had insisted on launching the global tour here in New York City, directly in the epicenter of the high society my parents had once worshipped and ultimately failed to infiltrate. I was not attending as a guest, hoping to be noticed by the right socialites. I was the primary curator, the executive director, and the sovereign rights holder of the entire exhibition. The cavernous marble hall buzzed with the absolute upper echelon of global culture. Ambassadors, museum directors, and international scholars circled the brilliantly illuminated display cases housing the restored royal archives. I wore a backless midnight blue velvet gown that cascaded into a sweeping train, commanding the space with every step I took. My locks were styled high, woven together into an intricate architectural crown atop my head, defying every sterile country club beauty standard Evelyn had ever tried to force upon me. Resting against my collarbone was the ultimate symbol of my absolute victory. The genuine emerald and gold heirloom, the very artifact my great-grandmother had smuggled out of Africa to protect it from thieves like Julian. It glowed with a fierce ancient fire, catching the flash of the official press cameras and drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. For the first time in my entire life, I was not shrinking myself to fit into an acceptable mold. I was not softening my voice or dulling my edge to make weak people feel comfortable. A tight circle of prominent European historians and African dignitaries surrounded me, hanging on to every word as I detailed the metallurgical composition of the 17th century chalice I had personally restored. They did not care about my pedigree or my lack of a trust fund. They cared about my intellect, my ruthless business acumen, and my uncompromising dedication to historical truth. A French ambassador bowed his head slightly, expressing his profound gratitude for my intervention in the sovereign archive. I accepted his praise with a gracious nod, feeling a deep, resonant peace settling into my bones. The elite society my mother had destroyed our family to impress was now standing in line just to shake my hand. But their validation was no longer the prize. The prize was the absolute freedom of standing entirely in my own power. I excused myself from the group and walked toward the primary display case, housing the restored African crown, the centerpiece of the entire collection. I stopped in front of the thick security glass, looking past the glowing emeralds to my own reflection staring back at me. The strategic gallery lighting caught the sharp angles of my face and the brilliant green stone at my throat. I saw a woman who had refused to inherit a legacy of generational self-hate. My parents had spent their entire lives running from their roots, bleaching their history, and chasing a hollow aristocratic fantasy. They had poured all their stolen resources into Chloe, molding her into a vapid, empty vessel designed to attract a fraudulent prince. They had hated my natural hair, my dark skin, and my relentless drive, because I was a walking reminder of the reality they desperately wanted to erase. Looking at the genuine emerald resting against my chest, I realized I had not merely survived my toxic family. I had actively dismantled their pathetic illusion. I had taken the very heritage they viewed as a liability and weaponized it, turning it into a billion-dollar empire built on absolute, unshakable authenticity. Evelyn and Marcus were currently navigating bankruptcy court, begging for leniency from the very financial systems they had tried to manipulate. Chloe was scrubbing grease traps in a fast food uniform, entirely stripped of her unearned arrogance. I had buried their legacy of shame and resurrected a legacy of undeniable power. I had won because I never tried to be anything other than exactly who I was. A warm, deep voice broke through my thoughts. It takes a remarkable mind to recognize the true value of things that others have foolishly discarded. I turned away from the glass to find a strikingly handsome man standing beside me. He wore a sharply tailored tuxedo that complemented his broad shoulders, and his dark eyes held a sharp, intelligent spark. I recognized him immediately. He was Dr. Elias Thorne, a renowned Oxford art historian, and the lead provenance researcher I had personally contracted for the European leg of the exhibition. He extended a crystal flute of vintage champagne toward me, his gaze completely bypassing the priceless artifacts in the room to focus entirely on me. "Your curation is nothing short of revolutionary, Maya," he said, his tone laced with profound, genuine respect. "You did not just restore a royal collection. You restored the truth and forced the entire world to acknowledge it." I took the champagne flute from his hand, my fingers brushing lightly against his. The brief contact sent a pleasant jolt of electricity up my arm. He did not ask about my family or my background. He did not care about the scandals or the tabloid rumors Marcus had tried to spread. He only saw the empire I had built and the brilliant woman standing before him. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the ambient light of the massive chandeliers overhead. To building real legacies, I proposed my voice clear and unwavering, carrying the weight of my hard-fought journey. Elias smiled, stepping closer as he clinked his glass gently against mine. The sound rang out clear and true. To building real legacies, he echoed, his eyes locked onto mine. I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the crisp sweetness wash over me. I looked out over the glittering crowd of diplomats and scholars, then back to Elias, feeling the absolute unbothered calm of a woman who had finally claimed her throne. The flashing cameras and the noise of the gala faded away, leaving only the brilliant, undeniable reality of my triumph. I smiled,